Today I want to share a recipe with you for making a healthy, fresh peach buckle. It's a very old-fashioned recipe, and I'm going to be making it using whole grain flour. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now the first thing that you want to do is preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and I think that's approximately 180 degrees Celsius. And you also want to adjust the rack in your oven. So if you have a rack in the middle position, you want to put it right under the middle position, so it's a little closer to the bottom of the oven, but not the lower rack. You want it to be just right under where the middle of the oven is. Now for this recipe, you're going to need about 4 cups of chopped peaches, and firm peaches work really well for this. But if you have soft peaches, don't worry, they're fine too. And if your peaches are firm, you can use a potato peeler or a vegetable peeler to peel off the skins, and that'll work great. If they're soft, you'll just want to bring some water up to a boil and dump them down into the water for about 30 seconds. The skins will split, then pull them out of the boiling water, and using a slotted spoon, so on and so forth, something like that, and plunge them into a bowl of water that's very cold or that you have ice cubes floating around in. And then you can pull them out and peel the skins off very easily. Now, what exactly is a peach buckle? It's a very old-fashioned recipe, and it's very easy to make. And you really can do this with any type of fruit. Right now, as I've shared with you in the past, I live in the Texas Hill Country, and we grow a lot of peaches here. And they're just so beautiful right now. And so I'm making a lot of different peach desserts, and I wanted to show you how to make a peach buckle. And the reason is, this couldn't be easier. You literally just mix up your batter in one bowl, mix in your peaches, put it in your pan, top it with some streusel, and then bake it. And you don't have to worry about it being perfect and the reason that it got its name, the buckle, is that all the heavy fruit causes the cake batter to kind of buckle, sort of implode in itself. So you don't have to worry about getting a perfect rise or anything like that. And then when you go in to cut it, all this beautiful fruit and the topping that you've put on it and the cake batter just make this wonderfully luscious, sweet and a little bit crunchy type cake. And because you're not worried about getting this perfectly beautiful risen cake, it lends itself beautifully to using whole grain flours, which tend to create heavier baked goods. So that's why I like to try and make this a little bit healthier rather than making it with white flour or plain flour, all-purpose flour. You may know it as that. You can use wonderful whole grain flours, thereby making this more nutritious. And because it is sort of the sugar on top and what do you call the topping, the crumb topping, has a little bit of cinnamon in it and normally would have a little bit of brown sugar in it. It lends itself very well to using a real sugar that's just the dried cane juice. Sometimes you may know it as sucanat, that contains all of the minerals that are in cane juice. So that's a nice part too, so that you have the whole grains and the whole sugars, making the overall dessert more nutritious. Now I'm going to start peeling these peaches so that I can get the 4 cups worth of fruit, and then I'll discuss the type of flour, the type of whole grain flour that I'm going to be using today. Now don't throw out these peach skins. Save all your scraps. You can do multiple things with them. You can make a homemade vinegar with them, and I'll put a link in the iCards if you're interested in learning how to make homemade vinegar from fruit scraps, and peach vinegar is terrific. You can also just throw these in a bag into the freezer with other scraps, maybe vegetable scraps you're saving for when you make a mineral broth. I have a video on how to make a mineral broth. I'll link to that in the iCards. Or just throw it in with your scraps your carrots, your onions, your celery, you know, for when you make bone broth. And this can add a delightful flavor to bone broth. So don't throw out your don't throw out your scraps. Then the next thing I'm going to do is, now that I've got the peach all peeled, I'm just going to cut this up into just little dice, you know, little cubes. You don't want it too small because you want, when you bite into the cake, to have a nice piece of peach, but about this size. And I'll overlay a picture so you can see a piece of the peach up close in my hand to give you an idea of what a good size is. But you're really looking for like a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. It's not an exact science, and anything will work. That's, you know, in that bite-size category. And then in my bowl here, I have a little bit of fresh lemon juice that I just squeezed in here. And once I get my cup full, I'm going to just dump that in there and toss it with the lemon juice, just to keep the peach from the cut up peach from browning until we get ready to put it into the batter. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue cutting up these peaches until I have a total of 4 cups, and that's what we're looking for, 4 cups of peaches. And 4 cups of peaches are going to be, you know, anywhere from 4 to 5 peaches, depending on the size of your peaches. As you see, that's 1 peach, and it's almost filled my cup. So that's what you're looking at. You're going to need about 4 or 5 of them. Well, I've got my 4 cups of cut up peaches here. They're tossed in lemon juice, and I'm just going to set those aside while we get ready to make the crumb topping. And I just want to mention that if you want the printable recipe, you can go to my website, marysnest.com, and you can just download it and print it out, whatever you want to do. Now today, the flour that I'm using, the whole grain flour that I'm using, is whole wheat pastry flour, and this is sprouted whole wheat pastry flour. And what I do is I buy soft white wheat berries, which is what pastry flour, whole wheat pastry flour, is made from, and I soak them and I sprout them, and then I dry them, and then I grind them into flour. Now you can use any type of whole grain flour that you want to use for this recipe, but you can certainly use sprouted flour, which is what I like to use whenever I'm making a cake or a quick bread or a muffin. And if you want to make your own sprouted flour from various wheat berries, you can do this with anything. You can do this with einkorn wheat berries, emmer wheat berries, spelt berries, soft white wheat berries, red wheat berries, white wheat berries, the red and the white wheat berries being from hard wheat. Any of those can be soaked, sprouted, dried, and then made into flour. Now, you know, ground into flour. Now, why would we do that? Well, I think we've had a lot of discussions here, but in the event that you're new, the reason is that I use sprouted flour whenever I'm not making a sourdough. So in this case, you're just making a cake or a quick bread, as I said, or a muffin, is because grains contain various anti-nutrients, and they contain something known as phytic acid. But when you soak them and sprout them, or if you use the flour to make a sourdough bread, so soaking, sprouting, or souring, helps to start deactivating that phytic acid. And it activates something called phytase, and it then deactivates the phytic acid. Well, why do we want to do that? Well, the reason is phytic acid that's naturally in grains is helpful to the grain. It helps protect it. But on the other hand, for us, it can make it difficult for us to assimilate the nutrients in our gut. So whether from the grains that we're eating or other nutrients from other foods, the phytic acid can bind to those nutrients and then remove them from our system before we're able to absorb the nutrients from our foods. So using flour that's been sprouted eliminates that phytic acid problem. Now, do we always need to do this, and does everyone need to soak their grains? Not necessarily. And I have a video that I'll link to the iCards where I talk about how in some cases phytic acid can be helpful, and it can certainly be helpful to certain groups of people. So depending on your ethnicity, depending on your ancestral lines, and just depending on your overall general health, your overall general gut health, whether you need to really soak grains or not can depend. But as I said, today I'm going to use sprouted flour, and I'm using whole wheat pastry flour, which comes from soft white wheat. But the nice thing about this recipe is you can also use any of the ancient grains, and you can use them either regular or sprouted. So you could use einkorn flour, whole grain einkorn flour to make this. You could use whole grain emmer flour. You could use whole grain, which is also known as farro. You can use whole grain spelt. I love baking with spelt. It really works like a charm. And any of those flours work well for this recipe because we're not focused on getting a really fantastic rise out of this cake, because it's all mixed with the fruit and so on and so forth. And it makes, even if you're using all-purpose flour, it does make more of a denser type cake. So it works beautifully for whole grain flours. And einkorn, the ancient grains, einkorn, emmer, and spelt, they're your ancient grains, and they're lower in gluten. So now they're not gluten-free, but if you're trying to cut down the amount of gluten that you consume, those ancient grains are a wonderful choice, and they work great in this recipe. So I've got that half a cup of the flour in here, the whole wheat pastry flour that's been sprouted. And then I've also got a half a cup of your dried cane juice. Sometimes you'll see this labeled as sucanat. And sometimes it used to be called also a brand Rapadura. I don't know if that's around anymore. But basically all it is dried cane juice, and sometimes you'll just see the package labeled like that. And what's nice about this is they just take the juice, so to speak, that comes from the sugar cane, and they dry it. So everything's intact, all the minerals and vitamins. So we're just going to go ahead and add that right in there. And then what I've got here is just a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon and just a pinch of salt. And you can use any salt you want. And there's just a fine ground salt, and literally just a pinch. It helps bring all the flavors together. And just a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon. Now, if you want, you can leave the cinnamon out of the streusel. It's not definitely required. And sometimes in summer desserts, where I'm using peaches or berries or whatnot, I wouldn't always add the cinnamon in, but especially with berries, I don't like it. But I find with the peaches, with the crumble topping, having just a little bit of cinnamon in, even though I equate that more with fall desserts, I find it's very nice. So I've just, as I said, just a 1/4 teaspoon of the cinnamon and just literally a pinch of the salt. So I'm just going to mix all of that together and just break up some of the chunks. You'll find when you use the dried cane juice, in many ways, you know, it's similar to commercial brown sugar that can sometimes clump and stick together because the dried cane juice is very rich in molasses, which is wonderfully nutritious. So I'm just going to mix that up a little. Then what I've got here is 4 tablespoons of butter, and it's just softened butter that I've cut up, and 4 tablespoons of butter is a half a stick of butter or a 1/4 cup of butter. So we're just going to go ahead and put that in, and then I'm just going to mix this up. I'm just going to use clean hands just to get it into sort of a sand consistency. You can certainly use forks or a pastry cutter, but it's really not necessary. So I'm just going in here with a clean hand, and I'm just basically running this all through my fingers, and I'm just going to get this to the texture of fine sand that if I squeezed it, it would clump together. Alrighty, well, I've got this all mixed together, and basically what I'll show you, I'll take a picture and I'll overlay it so that you can see up close. But what you want is if you squeeze it in your hand, it actually forms a solid, but that just by breaking it up with your hand very easily, it kind of goes right back to the sandy texture. So that's what you're looking for. And now all you want to do is set this crumb topping aside. Next thing that you want to do is decide what type of pan you're going to use. I've got a springform pan here that I really like to use for making this because I love the way I can put it on a cake plate and serve it for presentation purposes. It really looks lovely. But if you don't have a springform pan, don't worry. You can also use a cake pan like this. This is a 9-inch cake pan, but if you have an 8-inch cake pan, that's fine too. The only difference that it's going to make in this cake is the smaller the pan, a little bit higher rise, but it really doesn't matter. And if you use a cake pan like this, you'll want to just line it with parchment, grease the parchment paper, and then flour the cake pan. And then when it's all done and you bring it out of the oven, let it cool a little bit, Go around the edges with a knife and then put it either on a cutting board or a plate, whatever, cooling rack, and dump it out. And then you're just going to flip it. You're going to flip your cake back, maybe with a plate or your cake stand, whatever you're going to use, and flip it back right side up. Now, other options that you have are just baking pans like this. This is about an 8.5 by 11. This is about a 9 by 9 or an 8 by 8. Not exactly sure, but again, this recipe is very flexible and it doesn't really make a big difference. And in this, you wouldn't be flipping it out. You'd actually be serving it from one of these, and you would just cut slices and then remove them from the baking dish. And if you use a baking dish like this, or the oblong one, whatever you use, just make sure to grease it well and flour it. Now what I'm going to do is, as I explained, like with the cake pan, I'm also going to line my springform pan with parchment paper. Now, granted, this is an easy thing to use because I'm just going to unclip this and then I'm going to put the base onto a cake plate. However, I find that it makes it a lot easier when you go to slice it and pull a slice out if you have it sitting on parchment paper as opposed to sitting right on, this one is a glass bottom, sitting right on the bottom of the springform pan. So what I'm going to do is I've got my butter wrapper here and I'm just going to take a little dollop of the butter just down like that. It's got away from me. And I'm just going to put that on there to help stick this parchment paper down. Then I'm going to take the rest of the butter and I'm just going to go ahead and grease the parchment paper, the sides, and then I'll show you how I flour it. I've got this all greased up with butter, and for the dusting I'm just going to use a little all-purpose flour, and I'm just going to dust the bottom and the sides just to make sure that everything's well covered. Well, this is all buttered and well floured now, and if you find you have any excess, just tap it right out and you'll be fine. Now go ahead and set this aside and we'll make the cake batter. So you're going to want 1.5 cups of whatever flour that you're using, whatever whole grain flour you're using, and I've got 1.5 cups of my sprouted whole wheat pastry flour, and to that you're going to want to add 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and I like to use the aluminum-free baking powder. And then you're going to want 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and this is just a fine ground salt. And then this is 2/3 cup of the dried cane juice sugar. You could also use maple sugar if you want. It really doesn't, it's a lighter in color sugar, and it really doesn't have a very strong maple flavor, so that's always an option. You could also use date sugar or coconut sugar, and you can do the same too when you're making the crumble topping. Any of those types of sugars will work, but I've got the dried cane juice, the sucanat. It's very reasonably priced in comparison to some of those other sugars, but in any event, that's what I'm going to go ahead and use. It works perfectly in this recipe. And that's 2/3 cup of the dried cane juice. Now I'm just going to give these dry ingredients a little bit of a mix, nothing fancy. What I love about this batter is you can do it all in one bowl. The next thing you're going to want is 1.5 sticks of butter. So this is a nice way to use up, if you have 2 sticks of butter, you had 1/2 a stick go into the crumble topping, and now you've got the other 1.5 sticks that'll go into your batter. And if you have your ingredients softened, this will be easiest to do. So if you can have your butter softened and your eggs at room temperature, it'll mix together beautifully. And the next thing you want to go ahead and add are 2 large eggs. Now these are just farm eggs from right here in the hill country. And one of them, when I cracked it open, was a double yolk, but that's fine. Again, this recipe is very flexible, but if you have 2 large eggs, if they're small, you know, if they're just little farm eggs, you can add 3 eggs. Here I'm going to get that double yolk, so that's perfectly fine. And the final ingredient is 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla extract. Now I'm going to use an electric mixer. You can certainly mix this by hand if you want. It's pretty easy to do. It creates somewhat of a, you're going to find that it creates somewhat of a thick batter. Not as thick as a cookie dough, but thicker than just your traditional cake batter. And so I'm just going to start with this. I'm going to do about 30 seconds on a lower speed to try to incorporate everything so I don't have a big flour mess. And then we're going to go about 3 minutes or so on a higher speed to fully incorporate everything. Now I'm going to beat this on high for about 3 minutes until I get a nice batter. And then for the last little bit, I just like to come in with my spatula to make sure that everything is mixed well. And as you'll see, this is a thick batter. It's a thick cake batter, and that's exactly what you're looking for. And I'll overlay a picture so you can see it up close too, but hopefully that gives you a good indication by seeing how it's falling off the spatula. Will help you to know that you've got your batter right. But it is a nice thick batter. Now what I'm going to do is mix in most of the peaches, maybe just reserving maybe about a half a cup or so just to top the cake with. And then we just go ahead and just gently mix all of these peaches into the batter. Well, I have to apologize because some of my sound went out, so I'm going to overlay some pictures for you to show you exactly what I did. Added that fruit into the batter, I mixed it well, and then I poured it into the cake pan, and in my case, the springform pan. And you would do this into any pan that you were baking it. And then I poured it into the pan, and then I evened it out with my spatula to get a nice even layer in my pan. And then I topped it with the remaining little bits of fruit. Now you don't need to do that. I like to do that. I find it's quite lovely when it mixes with the crumb topping. But you can go ahead and mix all the fruit in with your batter and then pour it into your pan. Or you can reserve that little bit and then just sprinkle it on top of the cake batter with the fruit mixed in it. You can mix in the fruit, the majority of the fruit with the batter, and then just the little bit that you reserve, sprinkle that on top if you wish. And now what I started to do was to put the crumb topping on top of the cake. And basically you just want to give it a good squeeze like this, and then just break it up ever so gently as you're dropping it onto the cake, so that you have some large crumbs and some small crumbs. You just do it gently. Pull up a handful, give it a good squeeze, and then gently break it on top of the cake so that you've got those large crumbs and some small ones. Well, I've got all the crumb topping on top, and I took a close-up picture and I'll overlay it so that you can see the combination of some large crumbs and then some that are very small and then some that's just like sand. And that's perfect. That's exactly what you're looking for. Now, as I get ready to bake this, I like to put this on a baking pan or a baking sheet. It just makes it a lot easier to get it in and out of the oven. So now I'm going to go ahead and put this in my 350 degree Fahrenheit preheated oven on that slightly lower middle rack. You just want it a little lower than the actual middle oven rack. And we're going to bake this for probably close to 55 minutes. It may even take up to an hour, but I like to check it at 50 minutes. Well, look at this glorious peach buckle. It came so beautiful. I checked it at 50 minutes. It still needed a little more to go, so I left it in about an hour, and then I took it out and I just put it on a cooling rack here to let it cool for a while. You just want to let it cool for about 10 minutes before you try to, if you're using a cake pan, before you try to flip it over and release it from the cake pan. And since I'm using the springform pan, I'm just going to go around here and loosen the edges of this, and you'll want to do the same if you're using a cake pan before you try to flip it. Now some of the crumble topping, may get loosened, but it's easy enough to just put it back on, if you're using the cake pan. So I'm just going to go around like this, and then we'll loosen this and we'll put it up on the cake plate and we'll give it a taste. Oh, this just looks scrumptious. Now I'm going to put this down over here on my cake plate. It's still a little warm. I really should wait to cut it until it's completely cooled, but I don't know if we can wait that long. Well, the nice thing about a peach buckle is that you can serve this topped with a little ice cream or a little whipped cream for a dessert, or you can just slice it up like this and serve it as a coffee cake. At breakfast or brunch, whatever the case may be. It's going to be luscious. Look at this. It's just glorious. It's still a little warm, but actually quite warm, but it's just chock full with peaches. And we're just going to need to give this a taste. Oh, that's so delicious. Oh, so delicious. I really hope you'll give this a try. It's so easy to make, and it's really tasty with fresh peaches or any other fresh summer fruit you might have on hand. Well, if you'd like to learn more about traditional cooking, be sure to subscribe to my channel and then click on this video over here where I show you how to make some homemade ice cream without an ice cream maker, and it'll go perfect with this buckle. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.